Somewhere in a provincial records office, centuries after it stopped mattering to anyone alive, a clerk runs a finger down a column of numbers, pay deductions, boot repairs, grain rations. The air smells like old paper and dust. Rome kept this kind of paperwork with an almost obsessive precision. Every soldier accounted for, every coin traced, every unit's strength checked against the last report filed. And then the column just stops. No note, no explanation, no final entry marking the end. One line, there are 5,000 men on the books. The next relevant record, there aren't. This is not a story about a lost battle. Not yet. This is a story about an empire that could tell you exactly how much leather a single legionary's sandals cost in a given year, and somehow left no clear account of what happened to entire legions of those same men. 4 times in the span of about a century, a full Roman legion disappears from the historical record. Not defeated in some famous battle you already know the name of. Gone, quietly, in ways that still make historians argue with each other today. One of them is the most famous vanishing act in Roman history. A veteran legion, present in Britain for decades, active, functioning, recorded, and then never mentioned again. We'll come back to that one. Its name was the 9th. Hold that thought, but the 9th isn't where this starts. It isn't even the strangest case. To understand how a professional, bureaucratic, record-obsessed empire could lose track of 5,000 trained soldiers more than once, you have to start with the legion that vanished first and loudest on a frozen river at the edge of the world Rome thought it controlled. A river that, in the winter of 85, simply stopped being a border. Legio V Alaudae had been fighting for Rome since before Rome was an empire. Julius Caesar raised them himself, paid them out of his own pocket before the Senate ever recognized the unit, and gave them a nickname that stuck for over a century, the Larks, after the bird-wing crests on their Gallic-style helmets. These were not green recruits. This was a legion that had marched at Pharsalus, that had stood at Actium, that had bled through the disaster at Teutoburg Forest and kept existing anyway, which is more than most units from that catastrophe could say. By the year 85, the Larks were stationed on the Danube frontier in the province of Moesia, doing what veteran legions did, holding a line that had held for over a century. Then the river froze. In the winter of 85 into 86, the Dacian king sent his forces across the ice into Roman territory, and the province of Moesia was caught almost completely unprepared. The governor, a man named Appius Sabinus, was killed along with a significant portion of his forces. Some accounts place the Larks directly in that first catastrophic strike. Others argue their end came slightly later. Historians still argue about the exact sequence, but they don't argue about the outcome. Rome's answer was to send a bigger force. Domitian dispatched his own praetorian prefect, a man named Cornelius Fuscus, across the Danube with 5 or 6 legions to punish the Dacians directly. The march in was quiet, too quiet. Scouts reported empty ground where an army should have been waiting, and a column that size, moving through a mountain pass with no resistance, should have felt like good news. It didn't. It went worse than anyone expected. At a mountain pass called Tapae, the Dacian king Decebalus ambushed the Roman column from multiple directions at once. Men who had marched in formation for weeks suddenly couldn't see the enemy or find each other. Fuscus tried to hold his men together. He didn't manage it. He died there on that pass, and Legio V Alaudae, the Larks, Caesar's own legion, veterans of 100 years of Roman wars, died with him. Here's the part that makes this different from an ordinary defeat. A legion's eagle, the aquila, wasn't just a flag, it was cast in silver, carried at the head of the unit, and treated as something closer to a soul than a symbol. Losing men was a tragedy. Losing the eagle was closer to institutional death. An admission, in the most literal physical sense, that this legion no longer existed as a fighting body worth reforming. The eagle of the Larks went into Dacian hands, and it stayed there. For 15 years, it took another emperor, Trajan, and an entirely new war to finally walk into a captured Dacian fortress and find it. The actual silver eagle of a legion that had been destroyed a decade and a half earlier, sitting inside enemy territory as a trophy the whole time. Trajan recovered it. But recovering a symbol doesn't unkill 5,000 men. The Larks were never reformed. There was no Legio V Allodae Mark II. The name simply stopped being used, the way a company might quietly retire a product line that failed badly enough to be embarrassing. One legion, gone, its silver soul sitting in a foreign fort for a decade and a half before anyone came back for it. And this was only the first time it happened. So that's the pattern starting to form. A legion isn't a mob of soldiers you can quietly replace, the way you'd restock a warehouse. It's decades of training, tradition, and institutional memory wrapped around a name and a silver eagle. Building one takes a generation. Losing one, apparently, can take a single bad afternoon on a frozen river. And the Larks weren't an isolated accident. Rome was about to do something almost stranger with its next lost legion. Not destroy it in one dramatic ambush, but punish it first, and let the empire itself finish the job. If you're finding this as unsettling as I am, hit subscribe before we get to that one. Because the next legion's disappearance wasn't bad luck. It was policy. Legio XXI carried the nickname Rapax, the Predator, and it had earned it. Tacitus, the Roman historian, actually served alongside this legion for a stretch in the late 80s, and he didn't describe them as some forgettable garrison unit. He called them a corps of old and distinguished renown. This was a legion with a reputation, which makes what happened next feel less like an accident of war and more like a slow-motion punishment. In the year 89, the governor of Upper Germany, a man named Antonius Saturninus, rose up in revolt against Domitian. The 21st backed him. It was the wrong bet. The rebellion collapsed within weeks, put down before it could really spread, and Domitian was left with a group of legions that had just proven they could turn against him. He didn't execute the 21st. He didn't disband them on the spot either. He did something quieter and in its own way crueler. He split the rebellious legions apart so they could never combine forces again. And he sent the Predator Legion to Pannonia, one of the most exposed, dangerous stretches of the entire Danube frontier. Here's a term worth knowing. Damnatio memoriae, literally, the condemnation of memory. Usually it's talked about in connection with disgraced emperors. Their statues smashed, their names chiseled off monuments. But the same instinct shows up quietly in how Rome handled a legion that had embarrassed the emperor. No trial, no public disgrace, just reassignment to the place least likely to end well. And it didn't end well. 3 years later in 92, Sarmatian raiders crossed into Pannonia and the Predator Legion. Tacitus's corps of old and distinguished renown was massacred fighting them. No survivor's account made it into the major histories. No triumphant Roman counter-campaign to avenge them gets remembered the way Trajan's Dacian wars are remembered. The legion that had once been trusted enough to guard an emperor's own frontier simply stopped being mentioned. It was never reformed. Its number, the 21st, was never reissued to a new unit, which in the Roman legion system was itself unusual, almost like retiring a jersey number, except nobody explained why. Was the posting to Pannonia really a punishment, or just standard frontier rotation? Historians still disagree, but the timing is hard to ignore. A legion revolts. A legion gets sent somewhere dangerous. A legion dies there. And the empire that tracked every soldier's boot allowance left no official record connecting those three facts out loud. 2 legions down, both destroyed in battle, both on the same river, within 7 years of each other. If that were the whole pattern, this would already be a strange story. But the next disappearance doesn't even have a battle attached to it. And that's what makes it the strangest one yet. Legio the 22nd carried a strange name for a Roman unit. Diotariana after Diotarus, a Celtic king from Asia Minor who wasn't even Roman. He'd built the unit decades earlier as an ally's private army, and Rome eventually folded it into the official legion structure, keeping the foreign king's name attached like a fossil from before the empire existed. For over a century, this legion did what most legions did: guard a province, in this case Egypt, without ever making dramatic headlines. Then, sometime around the year 120, it got moved. The best evidence places the 22nd in Judea, in the years leading up to a massive Jewish uprising against Roman rule, the Bar Kokhba revolt, beginning in 132. And here's where the trail goes cold in a way that's different from anything we've looked at so far. There's no Tepe, no named commander dying in a mountain pass. No triumphant emperor discovering a captured eagle years later. There's an inscription found at a site called Caesarea Maritima that might reference this legion during the revolt. And then, nothing. When Rome compiled an official list of every existing legion in the year 145, the 22nd wasn't on it. No battle report, no casualty count, no official explanation. A legion that guarded a province for 100 years simply isn't on the list anymore. And the empire that produced that list didn't bother explaining the gap. This is not a story about a single ambush. This is not a story about one bad commander's decision. This is a story about what happens when an institution becomes so large and so used to controlling its own narrative that it can let an entire legion disappear from the books without writing down a reason. Because writing down the reason would mean admitting how badly a rebellion in one province had gone. Which brings us back to the 9th. Legio the 9th Hispana, one of Rome's oldest and most storied units, is last securely confirmed at a fortress in Eboracum, the city now called York, somewhere around the year 108. After that, the trail splits into 2 competing theories, and neither one has ever fully won. The first theory, the 9th marched north into Caledonia, into the unconquered territory beyond Roman Britain, and was destroyed there in a disaster brutal enough that Rome preferred silence to admission. This is the version that inspired novels and films for exactly that reason. It's the most dramatic, the most cinematic, the version where a lost legion marches into the fog and never marches back. The second theory is quieter and, according to several historians, more likely. That the 9th was simply transferred out of Britain to deal with unrest elsewhere in the empire. Possibly the same eastern frontier where the 22nd met its end, and was destroyed there instead, far from the misty Highland myth that made it famous. Under this version, there was no glorious last stand in Scotland at all. Just a routine transfer into a war that went badly, followed by the same institutional silence we've now seen 3 times. And here's the detail that should stop you. When that official Roman legion list was drawn up in 145, the same list that quietly dropped the 22nd, the 9th isn't on it either. 2 legions, 1 list, both simply absent, no note attached to either one. Somewhere, a scribe's stylus moved past 2 blank spaces where 2 legion names used to sit, and didn't slow down to explain why. Rome's own bureaucracy. The same bureaucracy precise enough to track a soldier's boot repairs down to the coin. Looked at 2 entire legions worth of missing men, and decided the correct paperwork response was silence. That's not an accident of record keeping. That's what an institution looks like when it has learned, very efficiently, how to file failure differently than it files victory. So, none of these legions actually vanished. Not really. The larks died on a frozen frontier, and their eagle sat in enemy hands for 15 years before anyone came back for it. The Predator Legion backed the wrong revolt and was quietly exiled to the one posting least likely to end well. The 22nd and the 9th, 2 legions, 10,000 men between them, simply stopped appearing on an official list with no explanation Rome ever bothered to write down. Here's what all 4 have in common. Rome wasn't bad at record keeping. Rome was extremely good at record keeping, which means the silence wasn't an accident. It was a choice, and that's worth sitting with for a second, because it's not just a Roman problem. Every large institution, an empire, an army, a company, a government, eventually learns the same trick. You don't have to lie about a failure if you simply stop writing about it. The paperwork just stops. And most of us never notice, because we're not the ones checking the ledger for a name that used to be there. Which of these 4 disappearances unsettles you the most? The larks on the ice, the Predator's quiet exile, or the silence around the 9th and the 22nd? Tell me below, because somewhere right now, some institution is doing the exact same thing. And the only difference between them and Rome is that we haven't found their missing column yet.